Hello, I hope you guys have had a great week since the last time we got on here. And I hope you guys are doing well with the Impressionism module. With that, one of the reasons I like that short clip from Doctor Who about Vincent van Gogh was just because it helps the gallery director is able to articulate some of the things that were so amazing about the Impressionist movement. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about uh, or revisit what movements and periods are. And then we'll talk about three different movements that grew directly out of Impressionism as kind of a response to Impressionism and the way the art world was functioning at that moment. And then I wanted to clarify a little bit of the about the uh, assignments, the reflection assignment and the studio assignment. Because the studio assignment, I thought I had changed that to make it more clear. I'm going to describe what you do, what you need to do, and then after the call tonight, I'm going to uh, revisit that and clarify it a little bit. Because these exercises in the studio assignment for this module are designed to be done as part of a group, but you can do them by yourself. And since you are doing this online, uh, we're going to talk about how to do those things by yourself so you get a similar feel and you can see what's going on. First, I was able to get everything graded. Everything is done and up to date. Um, there are a couple comments that I wanted to make about a few things. One, remember zeros are there just to remind you that something hasn't been turned in, or it's been turned in a format that my computer can't read. There were a number of assignments where somebody put in just like the wrong files, and so they didn't make any sense. But when I mentioned that, almost everybody immediately realized that they had submitted the wrong file, and within uh, usually a couple hours after I said something, they would uh, resubmit it with the proper files attached. So that was great. Um, I have noticed that there's a few assignments where uh, people haven't read the assignment description all the way through. For example, if there was an assignment where you needed to take notes for your brainstorming, type the notes out, and then uh, include an image of the sketches that you did and write the paragraph for that, sometimes the paragraph wouldn't be completely written or the sketches that were done wouldn't be photographed. And whenever I mentioned that again, people got right on it and resubmitted it. Sometimes the assignment calls for 4 or 5 of something, and a person would only submit 2 out of them. There was one person where the images were of 5 separate things, but there was no differentiation that I could see, and so I thought there were fewer things that submitted. And the person just turned around and resubmitted it, and they had just circled where the different things were, and that was a perfect solution. With the bibliography, I think a lot of people are doing this really well. There's a couple things that I need to mention. One is you can write the MLA format with periods separating each of the types of information, like the author's name, the title of the book or the article, publication date. As far as I know, MLA does not require you to put the copyright notice in. That is assumed if it's published, if it's, something is published. So if you've got notes or didn't get the points you needed, take a gander at those videos about MLA formatting and go to the sources that I talk about so you can see how to do that. And it was just going to save a lot of time if you go to a writing lab on campus. They will help you to put those things into shape and finalize them with the citations. And I also noticed that people need to remember to alphabetize those citations. There was a couple that I received where the indentations were all over the place. And so I honestly couldn't read it. I just asked them to resubmit it with indentations that are consistent so I can tell where the different paragraphs are. And there were a few also where instead of writing the 2 paragraphs, there was a summary paragraph and reflection paragraph. Only the summary paragraph was included, and so that chunk cuts off almost a quarter of the points if you forget one of those paragraphs. Um, either one paragraph or the other. So if you didn't get a perfect score, just look at it, look at the notes that I did, and even take it to the writing lab and have them help you. And I don't even think you need to go in person. You can, I think you can go online, make an appointment, and talk to them online. I'm not entirely sure about that, but definitely go to the writing lab or use the online resources that I put into that exercise description so that you can get the assignment correct. And then when you resubmit it, if you still have questions, let me know. Now, this last module, we talked about one particular art movement. This module, we're talking about three altogether. The difference between an art period and an art movement generally amounts to three different things. One is length of time. One is the area or grouping of people. And one is, or the third difference between them is what kind of the message, what's being responded to. Excuse me, an art period generally is going to be a lot longer than an art movement. An art period, it may be a generation and it may be several hundred years, could be anywhere in between that. If you look at early Christian art, that covers a period of anywhere from 250 to 500 years. If we look at dynastic art in Egypt, then we can either talk about art that was being produced during the dynasties, which covers several thousand years or a few thousand years, or we can talk about art within each dynasty, and then the art period is only a couple hundred years. But generally, an art period is going to be a significant amount of time that is at least a person's lifespan. So at least 30 to 50 years at the shortest, and it may be an art period may last over 1,000 years or a couple thousand years. The prehistory European cave painting art period covered maybe 30 to 40,000 years. So it's a significant amount of time. The second, and an art movement may be a couple weeks to a few decades. Generally, it's going to be, starting from an art movement is going to be within generally a time period of 5, 10, 15 years at the most. Unless somebody wants to revisit it, then because there are people today that are doing Dada art that is specifically designed to look like the Dada art that was done in 1915, so 100 years later, and it may be part an extension of the movement, but generally something like that is going to be a considered a revival rather than part of the actual movement, because it's been 100 years since the last time, since the actual Dadaist movement. So that's one point of difference. A period is generally going to be quite a bit longer, and a movement is going to be quite a bit shorter. Second is going to be basically geographic or cultural boundaries. An art period is generally going to be associated with a culture or a country or an area, a part of the world. Like, for example, if we look at Egyptian art or art from the Egyptian period, that's going to generally be bound by dynastic Egypt, the areas that in that part of the world. If we call Renaissance an art period, that's going to be covering centuries, but that's generally going to be in Europe. And so it's bounded by a geographical location, and the cultural confines are going to be Europeans, essentially. With an art movement, that is not so much bound by the geography. It's going to be bound more by associations, like several artists from a few different countries thinking along the same lines and doing similar things. So, for example, in Cubism, there's artists who are Spanish, French, and Italian. So it's not necessarily bound by one culture. Or Dadaists, there were Swiss, there were French, there were Germans, they were all Dadaists, and there were Americans. I mean, there was a Dadaist play that was written by a person living in New York. But the thing that united that movement is that these artists, even though they were from all around the world, they were addressing the same kind of issues. And that's the third thing. Looking at the motivations or the ideas being expressed. In art period, generally it's going to be the those ideas or ethics or symbols that are important to the culture at large that kind of holds that art period. So if we talk about an Egyptian art period or the period of Egyptian art, or rather Egyptian dynastic art, then the elements that we see, the motivations for the art and the symbols, are going to be the things that are important to the government of the cultural mores at the time. With an art movement, that is the uh, the thing that binds it together is the common expression or reaction of the artists involved. We talked about the impressionist. An impressionist artist was a lot more interested in doing something that expressed themselves and how they saw the world, as opposed to um, portraiture commissioned by uh, the ruling government. There were impressionists that did portraits, but the impressionism itself is bound more by what the artists were thinking, what their motives were, and we'll see that really clearly in Dadaism, Cubism, and Surrealism, which are movements and not periods. Now, there is a larger period that these were within, and that is the period of time between the world wars. Generally, going to be uh, 1910 to about 1925 or 1930. And World War One was in the teens, and World War Two started in arguably about 1938, 1939. So that's when these periods are this was bound within that time period. But again, these are three art movements. Now, if everybody is not sufficiently confused by all that, let me know, and I'd be happy to email you and really mess things up. But generally, like we talked about in the last module, art periods are long, covering countries and dealing with issues of the government or culture. And art movements are short, connecting individual artists, and are dealing with ideas and the reaction to specific ideas. All right. So that's a really short way of looking at that. And one of the questions that comes up for this module too is, what is art? That is a really difficult thing to for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. I think that there may very well be a definition, but whether or not there's a definition, these three movements that we're looking at, Dadaism, Cubism, and Surrealism, tried really hard to help people appreciate that a lot of things could be art that they hadn't considered before by pushing the boundaries of what people expected art to look like or to be. Some things done during these movements were done specifically to address the idea that art may just be the act of creation, building something that didn't exist before. Whether or not you understand it, whether or not the artist understands it, the fact that they're making something may very well be that part of the definition that is required to identify that thing as art. Just the fact that it's been made. Another thing that might identify art is placement. If it's in a gallery space or it's on a pedestal or it's hanging on a wall, maybe that's what makes it art. art doesn't have to fit what everybody expects it to be. Art doesn't only have to be specific genres or specific media. Art can be a fusion among media. Uh, we look at just filmmaking today. I really like Bollywood. I think there's a lot of fun in the films out of Bollywood, and that is, we have an idea in the U.S., very specific idea of what a film or a movie is, and then in Bollywood, there's movies that are produced that are part magical special effects, part uh, soap soap opera style drama, and part spontaneous musical. I was watching one Bollywood feature where somebody was zapped with nanites, turned into a superhero, and halfway through the movie, spontaneously, everybody in a bar started doing a song and dance number. And it's just my point with bringing that up is that it's still cinema, it's still a movie, but it combines a lot of different genres together. And I think that if we can accept that as a valid expression of movie making, um, we can enjoy it too. So keep that idea in the back of your head. But at this point in time, and we're talking about 1915 or so, this is right towards the beginning of World War One. Years prior was the invention of the steam locomotive and the steam engine for ship and transport. You get paint in tubes that we talked about, an understanding of physics where the whole world is made up of waves and particles. And so a lot of the times that influences how artists would do their paintings and using dots and short strokes. Uh, Artists were struggling with finding how they relate in a world where you can also have photography. So that all happened the generation before. And now we're at a point in time when galleries are really taking it upon themselves the responsibility to guide how people think about art. Galleries display specific things so that and rotate their paintings through every season. This is when you start uh, getting ideas where uh, maybe this painting is no longer fashion. This style of painting is no longer fashionable because the galleries want to sell you a new style of painting. They're the gallery masters or the gallery owners and directors are the ones that are kind of guiding public perception about what the latest art is. And this frustrated several artists because they became artists. I get to sidetrack just a little bit. There's an artist who's a friend of mine named Brian Krishiznik who talks about creating art for him is there's a pressure that builds up inside of him until something ruptures and it has to come out. And that's when he does a painting. That's when he builds art. And I kind of like that idea where art becomes then a function, almost a an organic or biological byproduct of creation. And a lot of artists, a lot of people who want to express themselves, they will use art as a mode for expression where simple words just aren't gonna do it. They want to touch the hearts of people, and it's rare that simple words are put together in the right order to really touch a person's soul. And in their frustration with how the gallery systems were kind of controlling what people accepted as art and what people expected as art, these artists decided that they were going to go at complete right angles to what everybody expected. And they chose and it was actually a group of friends that got together and they had a magazine for a while um, where they talked about these ideas. What is art? Maybe the only meaning art has to have is that the fact that it was made. And they would do things very seriously that seemed like nonsense to a lot of people because it was designed to help people access that part of their brains that was less rigid, um, and more creative. and help people to kind of step outside of the very rigid boundaries that have been artificially set up to define what art was for people at the time. So there would be performances where people would get together and somebody would get up and would just recite random words. Somebody else might do something that wasn't quite a dance, it was just a series of body movements that made people think as they were watching. There are a couple Dadaist plays that I mentioned that really don't seem to make a lot of sense. And they're designed not to make sense. They're designed to be confusing. And that's where the word Dadaism comes from. It was just a nonsense word. Your baby's making a lot of the time. Maybe it means dad, but maybe it doesn't. And it just, they could have picked any nonsense word, and Dada seemed to have the least amount of associated meaning, and so that was the word that they picked. So for a lot of people, the first time they look at Dadaism, it is absurdly nonsensical. I remember my grandpa absolutely hated it. He thought it was the biggest waste of time, and people were really stupid if they spent any time or wasted any money on anything that was Dadaist. He thought it was dumb and idiotic. But we get some really interesting things that come out of this. One is nonsense poetry, nonsense writing, where words are put together just because of the way they sound. There is Sesame Street rhythm soundscape where interesting words are just put together. If I can find that, I will put that on for extra credit too. But bouffant and galoshes were words that are used in this, not to express anything, just because they were fun words to say. And during this time, also, people started really getting into the idea of making an image as a collage. You guys have already tried your hand with collages with um, putting together textures and things like that. But before this time, nobody thought about really doing that seriously. There's a woman named Hannah Hoch who she was an early feminist, and in about 1915 or so, she started taking photos out of magazines and putting together into these very large and very complicated um, images that were just all these pictures that she cut out of people and things and places that she would put together. And then when you see it as a whole, it starts to make some sort of sense as a brand new image. This is the birth of what we call today as appropriation, where an artist will take imagery or snippets of somebody else's work and put it into their own. Uh, you, you look at DJs today that will do sound mixing using sampling, where they've taken sound samples of either the natural environment, the urban environment, or other people's music and put that in as part of their own rhythm and part of their own soundscape that they're creating. That's called appropriation, and that is an example of an audio collage, where it's made up of sound. You have a new sound that is made up of the sounds that other people have created. Foley artists that really got into their own in the 40s. Uh, Movies have almost always the sound has been recorded separate from or in addition to the footage on set or the visual footage. And Foley artists are the ones that make those sounds that when we can believe that we're actually in something that's going on. Foley artists for Jurassic Park, for example, put together several different noises so that we could get the Tyrannosaurus roar. Or you also see their work in movies where there's fantasy animals that make a lot of noise. Um, they will also do things that emphasize or so that you can tell when somebody's walking. The Lucasfilm invention of the surround sound system was really brings that out where we can feel like when we're watching a movie, we can feel like the sounds all around us. And that's an example of this the collage of sound that a Foley artist will put together so we could to expand our appreciation of the film environment. So those collages have an appropriation happen all the time, but it has its roots in Dadaism from over 100 years ago. And one of the main tenets that they were doing was proposing the idea that perhaps art can be art, not having to be something else, but just that something, the fact that something was made means that a human hand was involved, or that something was selected means that a human eye or a human mind was involved, and that part of the process alone may be enough to justify it as art. And if you don't like Dadaism, that's totally fine. But whether or not we like it, it has really informed a lot of what's going on in the world around us today. The next movement we're going to be talking about is Cubism. Um, Picasso and Braque, who are the two people who are considered among the founders of the Cubist art movement. And this started, I believe, in about 1910. They were heavily influenced by this just incredible imagery, ancient paintings, rock art that came out of areas like Zimbabwe, where you can tell that it's a human being, but it looks like it's a human being that's been drawn by several different people all at the same time. Or maybe it's a human being where the artist is showing different um, facets of the person at the same moment. When I don't know how many of you have taken engineering classes or have built things with plans. A lot of the times when we see plans for something today, you see a top view, a side view, um, a bottom view, and maybe a distance view. But all these things help us to get an image of what what the whole thing three-dimensionally will look like. Hold on just a second. I'll take care of that after this? Yeah, so. If that's okay. All right, let's, sorry, all right, there we go. If you can imagine somebody looking at something, top view, a side view, front view, back view, and then trying to paint all those things so that it's all seen at the same moment from one perspective, that gives you an idea of what Cubism is. There's a lot of angles involved, and one of the reasons why it's called Cubism is because when people first look at some of these early forays into the movement, it felt like it was very angular. If you can imagine like a cartoon or something like that, where you see the movement lines that help you know that somebody's running. And then if you could imagine somebody who's trying to paint somebody in front of them and trying to show those movement lines as well in that same plane that of the person that they're painting, you start seeing kind of an angular expression overlaying the human form. And that is one of the visual cues for Cubism. Some of the people that are really notable in this were Picasso, who's Spanish, Cezanne, who I believe was French, and Braque, who I thought he was Spanish too, but I can't remember. But those are three of the big names, but there were several other people that participated in it as well. And you can see its influence in several other artists also, even moving forward several years to the Russian and Italian futurists and other movements as well. But in Cubism, again, you have different facets of perspective overlaid on each other in the same visual plane. And so sometimes it'll look confusing. Like you'll see a profile blending into a full frontal uh, image of a person's face at the same time. So the artist may draw the nose sideways, even though you're looking at both eyes at the same time. And you might be able to see two different ears on the same side because maybe during the painting, the artist wanted to express the person moving their head a little bit, but you can see my ear there in one movement. And then maybe the artist is showing the other side as well, but he's also showing my face straight on. And so you'll have a really confusing, or it could be a very confusing set of images depicting a face, human head moving through time, but in a static image. This also comes at a point in time when people were very aware of mechanization. There was already a movement where the Luddites were afraid that mechanization would get rid of their jobs, and so they burned mills and destroyed equipment. 100 years later, so people are feeling some of the same emotions in Europe as job structures are changing, as people are uh, going into different styles of factories and doing different kinds of jobs because mechanization is shifting and changing. And a lot of that mechanization kind of feel is communicated with the Cubism as well. Then we get a third uh, movement at about this time, a little bit after the start of Dadaism and Cubism, about the same time period. We're moving into the 1920s, and this informed a lot of the Art Deco later on. But we're talking about Surrealism. And as you go through this part of the module, you'll see paintings that just have really odd shapes put together. And the surrealist that everybody thinks about is Salvador Dali. And you've probably seen The Melting Clock. That's the famous one. And um, what he was trying to do, and what the surrealists were trying to do, were taking people's expectations of the physical nature of surroundings and altering them and putting them together in different ways. They were also trying to take the cultural expectations that people came into a painting with and changing that up. So, in a lot of surrealism, you will see the artist is trying to touch the subconscious mind somehow, trying to relate to the imagination. And in order to do that, a lot of the times they will use uh, things that look like stylized symbols, like people in costumes posing specifically, or strange amalgams of animals that are painted in a very naturalistic way. This harkens a little bit back to alchemical illustration much earlier, where people are trying to show scientific processes with strange and distorted animals. But the difference is that in surrealism, what they were trying to do, rather than give you specific images that were meant to be symbols, they would give you something that made you think that this is supposed to be a symbol without it necessarily having to mean anything. It was exploring the idea of symbols for a symbol's sake, as opposed to a symbol pointing to any meaning behind it. And a third thing that a lot of the times surrealists would work with, so we get distortions of physical reality is one thing. Second one is use of things that to be read as symbols, whether or not they have any meaning, you see them as symbols for symbol's sake. And then the third is there's an underlying, and sometimes it is a little bit dark, but there, my observation is that in surrealism in general, there's a little bit of a sense of humor. And it's not a, you put your hands on your knees and laugh out loud kind of humor, but it's the idea of, like, Salvador Dali used a lot of boiled beans to make up people in his work, or he would use a lot of melted things like clocks that looked all floppy and wet, folding over stuff, or uh, other artists like Moreau would use images like discarded bits of uh, mechanical refuse, but he would put it together so it almost looked like a distorted doll or a toy, but or the shape rather than being scary as a human being used as a human face would look kind of comical a little bit or childlike, and so you see that a lot going on in surrealism as well. The images in surrealism, there may not be a story that you see, but because you see things that are intended to read as symbols, whether or not they mean anything, you feel that there should be a story there, and you can maybe even come up with a story of yourself. But it feels almost like you're looking in to at a snapshot of somebody else's dream, because all this represents some sort of, not necessarily a depiction of something taken out of a subconscious mind, but rather a depiction of what the subconscious mind could look like. So it's um, again, a lot of people don't like looking at these things, surrealism, Dadaism, or Cubism, because they don't see them as art, because they are kind of hard to understand. But what I want you to do as you look at this is just appreciate what's going on. Appreciate the world that people are coming into, where they feel that meaning is being pulled away from them, or meaning is being uh, defined by somebody else. When we should be able to kind of decide for ourselves what's important and what's not, rather than having somebody else just make those assumptions for us. Those are some of the questions that are being asked. So when you go into this, um, after you look at each of these three movements, Dada, Cubism, and Surrealism, the reflection that you need to write, I want you to just think about those three different movements, and then take a moment, take about 20 minutes to half an hour, reflect on all that, and then see if you can find any echoes of what you learned in today's advertising, for example. I think a really good example is the visual imagery for the 1980s, 1990s, really high-end fragrance commercials. They don't make any sense at all. You see somebody swimming in a swimming pool, somebody comes out, there's a plane flying overhead, the sky is really bright and blue, and then there's the name of the perfume. The story being told, the narrative being told, looks like it could be a dream much more readily than an actual story about what the perfume means. Watch commercials are really good for that too. Uh, they don't make any sense intrinsically as a story. They're just a set of images. We can see that in social media advertising. Uses a lot of the ideas that were originated in Dadaist movements. You get a lot of appropriation, cultural appropriation. You get a lot of image appropriation, a lot of sound sampling in contemporary music. If anybody's been to a party or a gathering done by a DJ that does a lot of sound sampling, it's the birth of that idea went back to the collages that were invented during Dadaism. The Australian version of The Voice, one of the winners was a young man who was a DJ. He did sound sampling, but he did sound sampling. All the sounds that he sampled were his own voice. It was kind of an interesting take on that. And a lot of the times we see people will take other sounds to use. Um, so think about that as you go into the reflection. Where do you see surrealism, Dadaism, or Cubism in today's world? Um, there's some interesting stuff going on with animations for opening and closing credits in movies, for examples, where it deals with some of those ideas that originated way back then. And then for the studio, I wanted to talk about that a bit. Um, the studio assignment for this was generated for a live classroom, and like I mentioned, I'm going to rewrite it tonight so that it makes a little bit more sense and you can do it yourself. But what you can do is either do this with a group of people, friend, family, roommates, stuff like that, or you can do it by yourself. The first one is uh, it's called Exquisite Corpse Sentences. The Dadaists, when they would gather together, the groups that they would get together, they would call their get-togethers the Exquisite Corpse. just because it really didn't seem to fit. And what this, what the first assignment is making a sentence out of random words. Rather than doing this with 5 different people, what I'm going to have you do is you will have 5 different piles, and for each pile you'll write down 5 words. The first pile will have an article and an adjective, and you'll write those together, and you'll write 5 different selections of that and put that in the pile so that the pieces of paper are face down. The second pile will have nouns. You'll have 5 different nouns, and you'll put that face down, mix them up. The third pile will have verbs. You'll have 5 different verbs, put that in a pile and put it down. The fourth pile will be another article and adjective. Same thing, you'll put that face down. And then the fifth one will be a second noun or a second selection of nouns. What you're going to be doing is going through each pile and randomly pulling these papers that you can't see, put them all face down in front of you and do that 5 times, and then turn all the papers over, and whether or not it makes sense, that's going to be your sentence in that word order. And I will give examples and describe that a little bit better. The third one, or the second one rather, this one I may get rid of it altogether. It's sentences and drawings, where a sentence and a drawing, you are supposed to combine them without, you're supposed to do a drawing from a random sentence. And what I'm thinking is, I can see what the assignment is looking for, but I'm thinking that we won't do that one. But the one that's labeled 4, which is actually the third one right now, is where you fold a piece of paper into thirds, and you're going to do the top part, the middle part, and the bottom part without seeing the rest of it. And what I want you to do is actually do several of these, 3 of these, where you kind of mix them up and you don't know which one you're drawing a body or a head to, or the feet to. And I will just, instead of going over that and recording that, it's basically what you're going to be doing is taking a piece of paper, fold it into thirds, then hold it so you can only see the top third. And you're going to do this to 3 pieces of paper, either 3 or 5. I'll have to think about that. And for that first top third, you're going to draw 3 different heads. Then you're going to fold that back so you can't see the head. All you can see are the little lines at the bottom of the head at the top of the next section. Then you're going to mix those up, and you're going to draw 3 different middles with little lines going over the bottom. And then when you're done with those, you're going to mix those up again. You're going to fold it over, mix it up again so you can't see what the other things are. And then you're going to draw the bottom of it. And I'll write that out, and you'll be able to, it'll make more sense. But these exercises, I think, will kind of give you an idea of what's going on inside the head of the Dadaists and the Surrealists and the Cubists. But I'll work on that a little bit. Don't worry too much about the studio things, but I should have those done for you so you can see them tonight. And if you have any questions, email me and let me know. But again, all the grades are done. Zeros, what do zeros mean? They just mean that you haven't turned in the assignment yet. All right. So as soon as you turn that in, let me know, and I will work to stay on top of the grading and get those things taken care of for you. All right. Thank you very much. I will look forward to seeing you guys next week. If you have any questions or anything like that, go through the module first and then email me. And if several people ask the same question, I will address that in the next time we're together. All right. Thank you very much. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week.